In 1977, the Qantas Lounge hosted a high-profile meeting. One of those in attendance was Gough Whitlam, just 2 years on from being fired as Prime Minister.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
But one of the others was Warren Christopher, Jimmy Carter's Assistant Secretary of State.
President Carter apologizes for his government's actions in Panama.
Jimmy Carter vows that the events of 1965 will never be repeated.
Christopher was clear. He was speaking on behalf of the president. And according to Carter himself, America would never again interfere with Australian domestic processes. But I wonder if you can spot the controversial word, again. Was Carter actually confirming that America hadn't just toppled the governments of faraway lands like the Congo, but had toppled the government of its most loyal ally? I want to tell you the story of Gough Whitlam, and saddle up, because ex-US intelligence officials say things like this.
Mr. Whitlam's government was a threat.
That's the way they described it.
Yes.
Did you get the impression that things had changed once the Labor government, the Whitlam government, came into office from what they had been before? And did they change after he left?
It was a bit of celebration that Mr. Whitlam had been canned.
So I'm going to start by playing you this interview. We don't actually know when it was recorded, but we assume 1964. At this point, Whitlam was the deputy leader of Labor, with the Conservative Menzies being in for over a decade and a half. Many were suggesting that Whitlam take over.
This is the way that ordinary men and women can have some say in their destiny through elected persons.
Now, it's hard to overstate just how dire the situation was for the Labor Party. So, Menzies had beaten Ben Chifley back in 1949. Chifley led a strong opposition, but actually died while in opposition. He was then replaced with Herbert Everett, who successfully opposed Menzies' attempt to ban the Communist Party. But when a Soviet spy defected to Australia, Everett accused the spy of faking documents and reached out to the Soviets to verify the accusation. In a Red Scare world, this was seen as treachery, and Labor were doomed. In fact, a group called Democratic Labor broke away from the Labor Party and campaigned against them with ads like this.
Voting in this election is a little like buying a car. Liberal model, looks flashy, costs a fortune to run. ALP, worn out, falling to pieces, only goes if you push. And we know who's pushing.
So Everett was completely ineffective, and he was replaced with another guy, Arthur Colwell. Colwell made an immediate impact, coming really close to taking government off of Menzies in the 1961 election. But Australia's attention was soon distracted by something else.
As American involvement in Vietnam increases, she looks to her loyal allies.
The nation looks at Menzies. What will he do?
Now, unlike World War II, Australia's participation wasn't simply a given. Britain had pursued a policy of involving themselves no further east of the Suez Canal, and other usual suspects like Canada and Poland were officially neutral. For Menzies, he'd built his platform around being strong against the communists, and so when he decided to support America, you'd actually be surprised at just how much popular support he had.
Tell me, what do you think about sending troops to Vietnam?
I think it's a good idea.
Well, if it's going to protect Australia, I think it's worthwhile.
I think it's got to be done. I haven't got any choice at this stage.
For Colwell and his deputy, Whitlam, they both opposed the war. But having brought Australia into the war, Menzies decided it was his time to retire.
I told both government parties that I was proposing to resign, and I told them the reasons in terms with which you are now familiar.
Menzies was replaced with a guy called Harold Holt, and in 1966, he convincingly beat Colwell in the election. For Labor, it was yet another defeat, making it 9 election losses in a row. For a reference point, that'd be the equivalent of the Republicans not winning a presidential election since Reagan. So 2 months after the election, Colwell resigned and in came Gough Whitlam. With each party having a new leader, his sole mission was to take down Harold Holt. But one day, Holt went for a swim at Cheviot Beach. We never saw him again.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned. A great search is being made for Mr. Holt off Portsea, Victoria. However, no official announcement has been made as to the fate of the Prime Minister.
So obviously having your leader presumably drown is a massive news story, but for us it's one for another day. Holt was replaced with a guy called John Gorton, who actually started to withdraw Australia from Vietnam. But in 1969, Whitlam made massive electoral gains and looked poised to defeat the Liberal Party in the next election. The Libs got skittish, knifed Gordon, and replaced him with Billy McMahon. After over 2 decades of Liberal government, finally the Liberals were here for the taking. And that became Whitlam's tagline.
As Whitlam launched his campaign, the crowd all chanted the mantra, "It's time."
The It's Time campaign galvanised a despondent voter base and offered the nation an exciting change to the status quo. 63 seats was what was required to form a majority, and in the 1972 election, Whitlam took Labor from 59 seats to 67. The Australian public indeed agreed that it was time for change, and the next 4 years would prove to be the biggest years of change in Australian history. In fact, Whitlam gave Australia its first taste of universal healthcare. Under the Liberal Party, free healthcare was made available to what were considered vulnerable groups such as migrants and the unemployed. Whitlam argued that this unfairly impacted low-income earners and that it actually instead made sense to invest in the healthcare of your workers.
The decision we will make for our country on the 2nd of December is a choice between the past and the future, between the habits and fears of the past and the demands and opportunities of the future.
Now, when Whitlam won the lower house in 1972, this was what the Senate looked like. With Liberal and Labor split evenly, Democratic Labor actually held the balance of power. So when Gough Whitlam proposed a 1.35% income tax to fund his Medibank policy, both the old and the new enemy teamed up to take it down in 1974. This actually, at least in part, triggered a double dissolution where every seat in both houses of parliament were to be once again contested for re-election. So in the 1974 election, Whitlam only lost one seat in the lower house, but unfortunately, the Senate was once again split in a dead even heat between Liberal and Labor. That detail's only going to be slightly important. But the saving grace for Whitlam was that Democratic Labor lost all 5 of their Senate seats, and so now only 2 road crossbenchers held the balance of power. The Liberals agreed to cooperate with Medibank on the condition that it came from other revenue streams apart from income tax.
After a tense standoff at the polls today, Mr. Whitlam emerged victorious. His Medibank bill successfully achieving universal health care.
And really, free healthcare only scratches the surface of Whitlam's reforms. So Whitlam not only abolished university fees, but also introduced legal aid. For anyone unfamiliar, that's Saul Goodman in Better Call Saul. Essentially free legal services for those who can't afford it. But one of the more underrated reforms was the attempt to have federal government take control of prices. So for context, the 1970s was a period of rapid inflation across the globe, and it was aptly called the Great Inflation.
Where the Americans had tried to pay for the Vietnam War on credit instead of putting up taxes. And they were exporting their inflation to all the countries they dealt with.
Now, Section 51 of the Australian Constitution divides powers up between state and federal government. And according to the Constitution, only state government had the power to control prices. In a time where inflation really needed to be curbed, Whitlam wanted the control of prices under his watch, and so put a referendum to the people. Unfortunately for Whitlam, this came across as a power grab, and Australia quite decisively voted no. Still, this signalled Whitlam's intent to redistribute wealth to Australian workers rather than into the profits of companies. In terms of what actually was in his control, he could pay federal government employees much more. With working for the Australian government now far more lucrative, private companies would have to pay their workers better to keep them. Under Whitlam, wage growth reached nearly 33%. Now, yes, some of this is because of global inflation, but inflation was only 17%. Just look at this graph here. In 1975, Australian workers had the highest share of national wealth ever. Quite quickly afterwards, it drops off a cliff. Whitlam also removed God Save the Queen as the national anthem, instead holding a survey on what the new one should be. The winner was Advance Australia Fair. Real missed opportunity. But the Whitlam government didn't just stop removing God Save the Queen, actually abolishing knighthoods altogether. Whitlam was starting to make his agenda very clear. He'd do things Australia's way.
Australia decides it knows better than the very nation that rescued them in their darkest hour. The ANZUS Treaty remains nothing but a mockery.
So some have made the argument that the CIA wanted to coup Whitlam for enacting what you could call more socialist policies. I think that's just plainly untrue, because the CIA really couldn't care less about what we did with our domestic policy. Take China for example. Having long recognised Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government, in 1971 Nixon started to make moves to instead move towards the communist mainland. After Mao fell out with the Soviets, Nixon felt the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and made secretive moves to meet with Mao through Pakistan. But here's the crazy thing. Gough Whitlam had already made that exact move. From opposition, Whitlam had visited China in 1971, and when his government came to power in 1972, Whitlam normalised relations with the PRC. For reference, Nixon visited in 1972, but America wouldn't normalise relations until 1979. So Gough Whitlam was pursuing something of a truly independent foreign policy, and in this respect, was actually ahead of America. Whitlam also formalised the independence of Papua New Guinea from Australia.
I cannot stress too often that the decision for independence is not only a decision about Papua New Guinea, it is about Australia and Australia's view of her own proper role in the world.
To much opposition within Australia, Whitlam supported Indonesia's annexation of East Timor, arguing that they were too small for self-government. Now, this was particularly controversial with much of his voter base, considering he had the exact opposite stance on Indigenous issues, abolishing the assimilation policy to instead give Indigenous self-determination. So, if the CIA couldn't care less about Whitlam's domestic policy, and in some instances were actually following Whitlam's lead on foreign policy, what motive could they possibly have to knife him? Well, Whitlam penned a pretty controversial letter. So, at the end of 1972, America was withdrawing from Vietnam and negotiations were stuttering. In order to bring the North back to the table, Nixon ordered strategic bombing in North Vietnam, killing an estimated 1,624 civilians. So Whitlam penned a letter to Nixon criticising them for the bombings. Not so much from a moral perspective, but more from a strategic perspective, saying that it won't bring them to the table to negotiate. However, his Minister for Overseas Trade, Jim Cairns, was far less shrewd, calling it totally and completely unjustifiable. For Nixon, Whitlam had crossed the line of brotherly criticism and so cut off communication with him.
Whitlam last visited the White House in July '73, and on that occasion relations between Washington and Canberra were at their lowest ebb. 3 Labor ministers had personally attacked the former American president, Mr. Nixon, and Mr. Whitlam had referred to the parlous state of the American presidency.
It's actually crazy to think that our Prime Minister was given the silent treatment. When Nixon was ready for communications to once again begin, it had to be on their terms, with National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger saying in 1973 that Whitlam needed to be, quote, kept in line. Yeah. In 1973, Whitlam's government also faced this issue.
Sydney has been put on high alert after right-wing Croat nationalists bombed the Yugoslav tourist agency in George Street.
So in 1973, the president of Yugoslavia, Josip Tito, was making a state visit to Australia. However, before he arrived, the Yugoslav tourist agency was bombed by right-wing Croatian separatists. For decades after World War II, there was heaps of Croatian migration to Australia. Like when Australia played Croatia in the 2006 World Cup, there were literal cousins playing against each other, and the Croat player who famously got 3 yellows was actually born and raised in Melbourne. However, Whitlam's Attorney General, a guy called Lionel Murphy, felt as though our intelligence organisation ASIO wasn't concerned enough about the risk of Croat violence to Tito. Murphy felt as though they were so focused with left-wing communist terror that they were actually ignoring the threat of right-wing terror as well, and he took pretty decisive action.
In quite unbelievable scenes, Lionel Murphy just skibbidied into the ASIO headquarters in an unprecedented raid.
Given that the CIA and ASIO were frequently intelligence sharing, and by intelligence sharing I mean that we were giving heaps of info to them and not necessarily getting that much back. And so Murphy's raid on ASIO wasn't just perceived as a message to Australian intelligence, but to the CIA too. For them, this had the potential to compromise operations. And so if all of that wasn't enough to worry about for America, there was also the Pine Gap issue.
The highly secretive Pine Gap spy base could be at serious risk of closure.
The Prime Minister made it unclear as to whether he would renew the US lease for the base.
So many of you would have seen the video where Friendly Geordies and Boy Boy tried to sneak into Pine Gap.
Well, the base doesn't want you here.
Okay.
So you'll have to exit.
What goes on in here?
Well, they don't tell me that. I'm not important enough.
Essentially, it's an American spy base that's right here in the middle of the outback. It was set up in 1966 to monitor missile tests in Asia. However, Kissinger used it to carpet bomb Cambodia and Vietnam and failed to inform Whitlam that he'd issued a DEFCON 3 alert to the base during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The key issue was that the lease was up for renewal in 1977, and Whitlam wasn't exactly always warm to the idea, even saying to Parliament that the Australian government takes the attitude that there should not be foreign military bases, stations or installations in Australia. We honour agreements covering existing stations, but we do not favour the extension or prolongation of any of those existing ones. If Whitlam were to win re-election in 1974, America would be in danger of losing its key asset. James Jesus Angleton even said this.
And when we saw this Whitlam government come into power, and this Attorney General moving in, barging in, we were deeply concerned as to the sanctity of the information.
But if you want to get rid of a foreign leader, it actually isn't just as simple as rocking up and assassinating them. For instance, the CIA unsuccessfully tried to assassinate Patrice Lumumba by poisoning his toothbrush, while unsuccessful in assassinating Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and in a post-JFK world, the House and Senate were now starting to look into CIA abuses of power. In other words, a coup would only really be possible if other circumstances turned against Whitlam. And the Senate proved to be that issue.
As the Senate waits in nothing but complete deadlock, the opposition leader says he'll only block supply if Whitlam's government were to commit a reprehensible act.
So remember, this was how the Senate looked after the 1974 election. However, in 1975, this guy, an independent senator called Michael Townley, joined the Liberal Party. This meant that it was 30 to Liberal, 29 to Labor, and 1 from the Liberal movement. This then got worse when Lionel Murphy resigned to take up a position on the High Court. The state that the senator was from got to choose a replacement for the outgoing senator, and it was convention to choose from the same party. However, the New South Wales Liberal government broke convention and chose Cleaver Bunton, someone with no party affiliation. So now the Senate looked like this. But once again, things got even worse.
The Queensland Senator Bertie Milliner has died. All eyes turn to Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen to choose his replacement. If he breaks convention, Whitlam's government will be in tatters.
So a Queensland Labor senator called Bertie Milliner actually died, giving the ultra-conservative Queensland Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen the power to choose his replacement. While Bjelke-Petersen did choose someone from the Labor Party, he chose a factional enemy of Whitlam's called Albert Field. So now it looked like this. Field was actually willing to vote against Whitlam, giving the new opposition Malcolm Fraser a majority in the Senate. Whitlam actually took Field to the High Court, and while this happened, Field agreed to stand aside. However, that reduced the number of senators down to 59, and with Fraser now having 30, that was still a majority.
It is the first time that the members of both houses have sat together as a single legislative body.
Fraser now had the power to torpedo Whitlam's government at any point. However, Fraser said he was waiting for, quote, reprehensible circumstances. In 1975, he got them.
How's this for a news story? The Australian Prime Minister could very well be sunk by Pakistani money that was linked to the assassinated King of Saudi Arabia, King Faisal.
Okay, so there were 2 main scandals that led to Fraser blocking supply, both involving Jim Cairns. Now, he'd been moved from Minister of Overseas Trade to now Treasurer, and while Treasurer, hired a new secretary with no experience, Junie Morosi. Yeah, you can probably see how this one ends. But remember, Cairns was the treasurer, and a married man might I add, and so people accused him of being far more concerned with philandering with his secretary than actually managing the economy. Though the affair wouldn't be confirmed until later, Whitlam was repeatedly asked about the appointment, and his mantra remained the same. Cairns' ministry, Cairns' decision. But the second scandal involving Jim Cairns also involved this guy, Rex Connor. He was Whitlam's Minister for Resources, and in 1975, he wanted to nationalize the mines. The theory was that they were our collective resources, and so their profits should be shared across the nation. Now, you can't just click your fingers and say, I own the mines. In a society of fair commerce, you actually have to buy majority ownership in the companies that are doing the digging. Again, remember, this was the Great Inflation, and so the government couldn't just go into deficit and print off more money to buy ownership. Instead, it needed a loan, and Rex Connor found a guy called Tirath Kemlani.
The disgraced Tirath Kemlani is set to come out to Australia and plead his case that Gough Whitlam knew all along about his blood money.
So Tirath Kemlani was a Pakistani financier who could hook up Rex Connor with the cash, $4 billion to be specific, to go ahead and nationalise the mines. Now, for big foreign loans like this, it had to go through the Loans Council and the Treasurer's Office, who, remember, was Jim Cairns at this point. Cairns approved the loan, but did not go through the council and then lied to Parliament about going through the council. How crazy is this though? The loan then fell through because Kemlani's provider was King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who was assassinated by his nephew before anything went through. When the news broke, Whitlam fired Cairns as treasurer and ordered Connor to pull the plug. Connor kept going in secret, and so Whitlam then fired him too. Not only did Whitlam's cabinet lie to Parliament, it also seemed as though Whitlam couldn't control them. It then got even crazier though, as Kemlani then came out to Australia and said that Whitlam was in on the loan the whole time, and at one point was interviewed by a young John Howard.
My standing was very good in Middle East and in the world where the monies are given in large sums, loans or other things, because I was dealing with commodity for the last 10 years. You see.
So this is in fact the first real loan that you've been engaged in as a money broker?
Yes.
Despite not actually producing any proof, Fraser had his reprehensible circumstances and ordered the Senate to block supply. By the way, supply was the bill that allocated funding to federal government employees. If you couldn't get that bill through, then you couldn't pay your workers and therefore you have no government.
The meeting condemned the threats by the Prime Minister to attempt to govern without a budget. It was a threat to the basic safeguard of democracy. The meeting today expressed absolute determination to let the people be the judges through a general election. They agreed that any attempt to bypass the proper parliamentary processes should be opposed in every way possible.
So when Fraser did this, all eyes turned to the Governor-General. Part of the hangover of being a British colony is that the King or Queen still has a representative to the Australian government called the Governor-General. So for Whitlam, he nominated a guy called John Kerr to be that representative. Kerr and Whitlam had only briefly crossed paths when Whitlam was a lawyer and Kerr was an esteemed New South Wales judge. However, back in the early 50s, Kerr was involved in the Labor Party, and so Whitlam thought he ticked both boxes of being highly esteemed in the legal arena while also supporting his agenda. But really, Whitlam couldn't have been more wrong. Not only had Kerr abandoned his support for Labor for now decades, but he also didn't view his job the same way his predecessors did, which was as a purely ceremonial one. Kerr insisted to Whitlam that as Governor-General, he be allowed to represent Australia as head of state to other nations and get 10 years in office.
It's an office which stands high under the Australian Constitution, and I feel that it is one in which I can do interesting and useful things.
So in section 61 of the Constitution, the Governor-General clearly does have the power to sack the government. However, this had never been used before, and only once had it been used on a state level. When New South Wales Premier Jack Lang was fired in 1932, it nearly caused a civil war. For that reason, Whitlam certainly held the view that the Governor-General had now become a purely ceremonial role. For Whitlam, if he really wanted to, he could recall Kerr. So when Fraser blocked supply in October, the government was essentially non-functional. Whitlam's idea to break the deadlock was to hold a half-Senate election. His theory was that the nation would be so frightened at the prospect of no government that they'd flock to vote for Labor. Fraser wanted another double dissolution and for all seats in both houses of parliament to once again be up for grabs. And this is where it gets really intense. On November the 11th, Whitlam called John Kerr to suggest his intention to call for a half-Senate election in Parliament that afternoon. Kerr asked him to come to his office and had arranged for Fraser to come 15 minutes later. However, Whitlam got there 15 minutes late and so arrived to see Fraser in the waiting room. At this point, he knew what Kerr was about to do.
Incredible news coming out from the capital. Gough Whitlam has been fired.
The Governor-General to Her Majesty has made the controversial call to sack the Prime Minister.
So Kerr dismissed Whitlam's government and ordered Fraser to make a new caretaker government until new elections could be held. Crazily, that afternoon, Fraser put his supply bill to the Senate and Labor unanimously passed it because they still hadn't gotten the news that Whitlam had been fired. At the same time, literally while Whitlam was meeting with Kerr, the lower house passed a motion of confidence in Whitlam. The Speaker of the House, Gordon Scholes, wanted Kerr to pass that on to the Queen, but Kerr refused to meet with Scholes. When Scholes went straight to the Queen's Secretary Martin Charteris, he said that it wouldn't be proper for her to intervene. So Whitlam never got that half-Senate election, and instead of being able to go to the polls on his terms, it was Fraser who instead could take the upper hand by simply saying, look at all of this chaos. I mean, just look at this ad.
Australia, you've been sleeping, brought down to your knees. We've lost a lot of living in the dark of these 3 years. We can look towards the future and the way things ought to be. Turn on the lights, Australia!
So suffice to say, Fraser smashed Whitlam in the 1975 election. I mean, just look at this 30-seat swing. Crazily though, Whitlam actually accused Doug Anthony, the leader of the National Party and Fraser's coalition partner, of being on the payroll of the CIA. But before I get there, ad rev for Australian history videos isn't exactly the most lucrative stream of income. In fact, some videos actually run at a loss. But that's no reason to abandon Australian history. At Mr. M History, we are the loyal 30-odd thousand people or so that have chosen to follow Edmund Barton over Piers Morgan. In order to keep making documentaries like this, we actually can't just rely on AdRev. For that reason, we've set the 10 plus Prime Ministers in 10 days challenge, where we actually walk you through the first 50 years of federated Australian history with lectures and activities. Not only that, but you actually get to shout out a message on the pod and influence the official poll as to who Australia's best Prime Minister was from 1900 to 1950. It's $20, these are some of the reviews. Click the link in the description to sign up. Anyway, the first reason why the CIA theory has legs is because of a guy called Christopher Boyce. He's most famous for having a movie made about him called The Falcon and the Snowman, a story of how he started to sell US secrets to the Soviet Union. But according to Boyce, he only sold the secrets to the Soviets because he was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the state of American intelligence. And it was actually his discoveries around Whitlam which caused that initial disillusionment.
The executive agreement meant that all information was to be shared between the American government and the Australian government. And along came Mr. Whitlam. When I went to work for the project, the initial security briefing that I had, I was told that in fact we weren't going to live up to that agreement and that we hadn't been, and that there was information that was being withheld, and also that the Argus project, which was the advanced rhyolite project, was to be hidden from Australians.
So Boyce worked for a company called TRW, an aerospace and weapons contractor closely affiliated with US security. Essentially, he was based in Los Angeles and got messages from Pine Gap. And just listen to the way he said his colleagues spoke about Whitlam.
Even though the bases were in Australia? Well, yes, Mr. Whitlam's government was a threat.
That's the way they described it?
Yes.
Did you get the impression that things had changed once the Labor government, the Whitlam government, came into office from what they had been before? And did they change after he left?
It was a bit of celebration that Mr. Whitlam had been canned.
But simply having a motive isn't proof of anything. To be honest, I'd be really surprised if the Americans weren't talking about Whitlam in that way. To prove a conspiracy, we need to link the actions of US intelligence to the actual outcome.
Did they talk about how or why he was forced out?
No, but there was references to your Governor-General by the Central Intelligence resident there at TRW in the Rhyolite Project. They called Mr. Kerr, our man Kerr.
What, the CIA man said that?
Yes, Joe Harrison said that in the security area one time I ever heard that.
You heard that correctly. I mean, he might be the only American you've ever heard to use the term Governor-General. But Boyce very strongly made the allegation that his colleagues spoke fondly of Kerr. And Boyce would apologise for a lot in his life, particularly his theft and rash anger as a young man. But in 2014, he doubled down on this statement.
I thought your Governor-General, when he finally pulled the plug on Whitlam, I thought he was a CIA, flunky. I thought, and he was greatly admired in the project. I mean, the CIA resident there, Joe Harrison, was walking around calling him our man Kerr.
Ultimately, Boyce finished the interview by saying that he was certain that a coup happened, but that he just couldn't prove it.
To me, that was a coup. You Australians can call it whatever you want, but I cannot sit here and prove it, but I believe it.
So this guy right here is a guy who actually has quite little search results on Google, Marshall Green. He was previously the ambassador to Indonesia, but in 1973 became the ambassador to Australia. What's also fascinating about him was that he had a nickname, the Coup Master. Just weeks after landing on the ground in Indonesia, the CIA supported Suharto in not only dethroning Sukarno, but in also executing anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million communist affiliates.
Well, according to what I've heard, Marshall Green told Whitlam that he was concerned that I, as Deputy Prime Minister, the second person in Australia apparently, would find out what those bases were for. Apparently only one had to know, and that was Whitlam.
But what role did Green have in ousting Whitlam? Well, according to one of Whitlam's ministers, Clyde Cameron, almost every country he ever went to had an uprising. And in 1983, he said Australia was no different. You can look at the video on the ASO website. I can't play it for legal reasons, but link will be in the description. But more than that, the late great John Pilger actually wrote of an incident where Cameron claimed that Green had been even more direct. In response to Labor's attempt to nationalize the mines and therefore threaten the profits of US multinationals, Cameron alleged that Green said we would move in. What you might not know was that after Whitlam's victory in 1974, Nixon had commissioned a report, most of which is still heavily redacted, on investment prospects in Australia. In November of 1974, Green had lunch with Rupert Murdoch, where Murdoch predicted that Whitlam would be finished in a year due to Senate issues. Whitlam's minerals policy actually threatened a business venture of Murdoch's, which was a joint venture with BHP to build an alumina refinery. In early 1975, Murdoch ordered his editors to quote-unquote kill Whitlam.
Gough Whitlam, more like Cough Spitlam, communist scum.
So the next man in focus is actually the president himself, Jimmy Carter. After Watergate, Gerald Ford took over the poison Republican chalice and lost to the Democrat Carter.
It's a new era as Carter apologises for the sins of US intelligence's past. According to the president, America will uphold the sovereignty of other nations.
Now, Carter's pretty well known as a president that sought to curb the influence of the CIA, and in his first year in office, went on something of an apology tour to atone for the sins of their past. So at this meeting in 1977, where his Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher, his ambassador to Australia Philip Alston, Whitlam's private secretary Richard Butler, and of course, Whitlam himself. According to Whitlam, these were the key takeaways from the meeting. Firstly, Christopher made it clear that he was communicating on behalf of the president. Secondly, Carter respected the democratic rights of its allies. Thirdly, that Carter would work with whatever government was elected. And finally, that America would never again interfere with Australian domestic processes. Of course, what's most notable is the use of the word again. Alston died in 1998 and never commented on the issue. However, in 2007, Christopher confirmed the meeting and made no attempt to rebut Whitlam's account. That only left Richard Butler, who also spoke of the account in 2014. According to Butler, Whitlam was actually quite scatty for the years after his dismissal and asked no follow-up questions. Butler said that after the meeting he said to him, "Comrade, what was that all about?" With Carter approaching 100, there's a great likelihood that the intention of this meeting will die with him. But there's still even more.
It's one of Australia's biggest mysteries, involving drug trafficking, money laundering, CIA spies, and claims of murder. The collapse of the infamous Nugan Hand Bank wiped out tens of millions of dollars.
So Frank Nugan was an Australian guy who co-founded a bank with an American called Michael Hand. Aptly, it was called Nugan Hand Bank. Now, a number of high-profile Australians, including the former leader of the New South Wales Liberal Party, John Dowd, have accused the bank of circulating money for drug lords and the CIA. Their staff was also stacked with old CIA workers, including the ex-CIA director, William Colby. As a really interesting footnote, Michael Hand actually murdered Frank Nugan in 1980, and then he went missing for 35 years. That was until he was found in Idaho in 2015.
Michael John Hand, Lost Coulthard, 60 Minutes Australia. We've been looking for you for a long time, sir.
I mean, how on earth did that work as a disguise? But what does this have to do with Whitlam? Well, the American journalist, William Blum, author of Killing Hope, has actually argued that the CIA used Nugan Hand Bank to launder $2.4 million into the Liberal Party for the 1975 election. Not only that, but when the New South Wales Attorney General Frank Walker launched an attack on the crimes of big businesses, Nugan Hand then opened a Swiss bank account in his name and blackmailed him with leaking that information. In 1980, the bank collapsed with about $50 million of debt. Either this was the most incompetent bank that you could run, or it was never really meant for profit. But there's also one other actor I want to discuss, the Crown.
For several years now, academic and Gough Whitlam biographer Jenny Hocking has been trying to get her hands on the secret letters that were written between the Queen and Sir John Kerr at the time of the 1975 dismissal.
But before I get there, I do just want to let you know about the Mr. M History podcast as well. I don't know if you've had the experience of listening to a history podcast where just 5 minutes in, they've gone on an extensive monologue and you have well and truly zoned out. On Mr. M, we've got Ben and PY, who are just average Joes that keep me accountable and ask the questions that the audience is thinking.
The French probably want the harshest penalties, right?
Correct.
Because they've been they were the closest
the worst
to it.
hit, right?
Yeah,
Because they never really got to England.
They surrendered in World War II.
Yeah.
Well,
you were still thinking about which way were you?
We've got over 50 topics that you can look at wherever you get your pods. Now, when it comes to the Royals, I really do want to make one thing clear. I'm Team Piers Morgan, and so that actually might cloud my view. But to actually defend them here, remember that John Kerr was looking to wield a power that many considered to be extinct. To make such a big move, he needed some validation, and so he went looking to the Crown. What's really interesting is that a historian from the Whitlam Institute, Jenny Hocking, sought access to Kerr's letters to the Crown. By Australian law, this was possible after a 30-year waiting period because it no longer compromised national security and could give us some pretty juicy history. However, the National Archives opposed them being made public on the basis that they were personal rather than government documents. The case went to the High Court, and the court sided with Hocking and basically said, show us the emails. Jenny Hocking then wrote a brilliant book called The Palace Letters. Now, there's heaps of examples that you could choose from, but I want to draw your attention to just a couple. The first came from correspondence with Prince Charles. So Papua New Guinea celebrated independence from Australia on September the 16th, 1975, exactly 1 month before Fraser blocked supply. Prince Charles and John Kerr were both at the celebrations. The next month, Kerr actually wrote a letter to the Queen's secretary, Martin Charteris. That's this guy from the Crown.
Martin, you've worked at the palace now for what, 3 years? I'd have thought that long enough for you to know the ropes, understand the rules, the way things are done.
I think I do.
Manifestly not.
In the letter to Charteris, Kerr recounted a conversation with Prince Charles where he said he was weighing up sacking Whitlam. Remember, this was still a month before supply got blocked. According to Kerr, Charles gave him assurance that if Whitlam fired him first, the Queen wouldn't necessarily have to accept Whitlam's request to recall him from duty. Not only that, but in letters between Charles and Kerr in March of 1976, Charles congratulated Kerr on taking, quote, right and courageous action. Remember, this was just months after Charteris had said that he wouldn't read the lower house's vote of confidence in Whitlam because that would be breaking neutrality. On top of that, Charteris pointed Kerr in the direction of a Canadian common law expert called Eugene Fawsey, who was a big advocate for using the power to sack the government. So we are a very long way into this video, so I probably should reach the point where I give you my verdict. For me, what's really clear is that both the CIA and the Crown were no fans of Whitlam whatsoever, and would appreciate if he no longer continued as the leader to shore up Australia as its future ally. Personally, I find the testimony of Christopher Boyce really compelling, and it does seem to match the testimony of both Clyde Cameron and what Jimmy Carter was seeming to be indicating. When asking the question of whether or not the CIA took action, I think the case of Nason Bank shows that they at least did in some respect. What's missing here is the link between the CIA and John Kerr. Apart from him being called Our Man Kerr, there's no silver bullet which actually links the CIA with Kerr's decision to fire Whitlam. Look, I think they probably did, but we don't yet have the documents. What I'm much less convinced of is that Australia otherwise would have voted Whitlam back in. Murdoch has never needed the CIA to take down an enemy of his. Whitlam's cabinet seemed to function in a pretty chaotic way, and for a long while, Fraser was well liked in Australia. That being said, 2 years is a long time in politics, and going into an election in 1977, perhaps Whitlam could have changed the tide. Nonetheless, when Whitlam contested Fraser in the 1977 election, he only gained 2 seats and still lost convincingly, afterwards stepping down as the leader of Labor. Like I said though, this wasn't the only time that a Labor leader had been fired by the Crown.
The Premier has been fired. Governor Philip Game today announced that Jack Lang is relieved of his duty.
When it happened the last time, the Army and the New South Wales Police were ready for a civil war. Click here to learn all about Jack Lang.